I'm Dr. Tracy Stecker, and welcome to the Choosing Help podcast. Choosing Help presents conversations about courage, connection, and the transformative power of asking for support. Through candid discussions, expert insights, and real world stories, this podcast breaks down stigma and opens doors to understanding. Join our community committed to compassion and courage, because when we choose help, we choose life. Welcome to Choosing Help. I'm Dr. Tracy Stecker, and I'm here today with Dr. Keyne Law. Dr. Law is a clinical psychologist at Seattle Pacific University, and she is a researcher developing new ways to understand why and how people act on suicidal thoughts. She's studying how people make decisions during a suicidal crisis. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Law.
Hi, excited to be here, Tracy. Thank you for having me on your show.
This is a really important topic because, as anybody knows who's lost somebody to suicide, it is devastating when you lose somebody to suicide. And I think there are several questions people ask themselves. I'm going to go ahead and list the four questions that I hear a lot, and then we'll just break them down one by one. One, how common is it that people have suicidal thoughts? Two, if somebody is having a thought, does that mean they're going to act on their thought? Three, um, how would we know if somebody was suicidal? And then four, how do we stop somebody who's thinking about suicide? So I put two and three in kind of a weird order there. I didn't mean to, but the first one is how common is it and would we know if somebody was suicidal? Can you speak on that?
Yeah, for sure. That is a question I hear a lot, and I don't have the hard numbers in front of me right now, but in terms of lifetime suicidal ideation, the last number I read was that 1 in 4 people in the United States will have had thought about suicide sometime in their lifetime. Um, and in the past year, about 4.3%, I think, of US adults have had suicidal ideation in this past year. So it's pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we think about it from a lifespan perspective, but maybe less common within the past year. And unfortunately, the current state of the science is that after 50 years of suicide research, right, our ability to predict whether or not somebody will die by suicide is terribly awful. We're no better than a coin flip. And there was a really big meta-analysis back in 2017 by Joseph Franklin and colleagues that really kind of showed those numbers, um, that we really haven't gotten better at predicting suicide. So there's not really a clear way of really knowing whether or not somebody is going to act on those suicidal thoughts, and if they're suicidal. And the only real way that we could know is to ask about it. Because even our current warning signs, right? Like a lot of research has found that the warning signs itself aren't really even that helpful. And they're kind of vague and they're clinically derived, most of them, and they can be kind of helpful in raising some red flags, but they're just not super accurate. And so the only real way to truly know if somebody's thinking about suicide or if they're suicidal is to actually just ask them directly and to use the word suicide in asking. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah.
Okay, so suicidal thoughts are
Mm-hmm.
very common,
Mm-hmm.
and there are a lot of risk factors for who might be having those thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
but you won't necessarily know if you're worried about somebody. The only way to know if they're having those thoughts is to flat out ask them, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?"
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that will probably trigger some red flags, right? Changes in behavior, changes in the way they usually are, or maybe you notice that they're going through a really difficult time that where somebody might start having some of these darker thoughts.
Hmm.
Um, but the thing is, we don't really know whether or not they're truly thinking about it until we actually ask. All we can get are these hypotheses, like things that we can form hypotheses around if they're having
Hmm.
these thoughts, right? But we
Hmm.
don't actually, we need to actually test that hypothesis by asking.
And so somebody might say, they feel uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable going up to somebody and saying, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" And so, as
Mhm.
two psychologists on this podcast right
Mhm.
now, we're going to reassure you that it's okay to ask that question. You can literally just ask that question: "Are you having thoughts of suicide right now?" It is not going to make them think about suicide. It is not going to make them act on a thought if they were having one. It is the way of saying, we're checking on you. Are you having these thoughts?
Yeah, and something that I think is really interesting is from some of the research around asking people about suicide. Asking actually can reduce the intensity of their suicidal ideation too, because they feel seen. They're like, oh, finally, someone who I'm able to talk about this with. And so can
Hmm.
actually decrease the intensity of suicidal ideation when you ask. And I know some folks, when I do workshops and whatnot, they oftentimes ask me, well, what if I'm wrong? And it's really awkward. And I kind of say, well, it's probably better to be have a little awkward moment of like whoopsies, like I got that wrong. Wow. Than to regret never asking and knowing that, you could have asked in that moment and maybe have helped them.
And at least you showed concern for the person. If people are going through a hard time, it's nice for somebody to come up and say, "Are you okay? Are you
Mhm.
doing okay?" Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and usually framing the question around like, hey, like I'm noticing that, you've been having a really hard time getting out of bed, or like, you've kind of started saying a lot of things like, man, my life really sucks and
Mm.
it's not really worth living anymore. You can kind of frame it around those things that kind of flagged that for you that something might be going on and
Yeah.
use them to frame the question too, so it doesn't feel abrupt or, out of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Just let them know what you've been noticing. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
that you're concerned for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, okay, let's say somebody is having thoughts of suicide. How likely are they to act on them?
Yeah, so a lot of times there's a lot of folks who think about suicide, but not as many folks who actually act on those thoughts. So I think I cited the statistic of 4.3% of US adults have past year thoughts about in the past year thought about suicide. Only about 0.6% actually go on to attempt suicide. And so it's a very small fraction of folks who actually think about suicide that actually go on to make an attempt. And I know that there's some research on adolescents, even like a longitudinal study on adolescents, that have found that even like 10 years later, they ask, these folks that have said that they had suicidal ideation in their childhood, if they've ever had thoughts about suicide, and they're not recalling that. They're like, nope, never had these thoughts, even though they reported it 10 years ago, which has been really interesting.
Hmm. So just because somebody is having a thought of suicide does not mean they're going to act on that, which can reassure some people. It's okay
Mhm.
to ask about it. It's good to show concern, be direct. And just because you have the conversation or they're having the thoughts does not mean that they're likely to act on those thoughts.
Yeah, and having those thoughts doesn't necessarily even mean that they're currently in a suicide crisis or that they're going to do anything within the next 24 hours or in the immediate future. And so I think oftentimes, folks hear people, say that they're thinking about suicide or they're having these thoughts, and the alarm bells start going off, right? And immediately they're like, well, now we have to take you to the emergency room and get you emergency services and everything like that. And in fact, a lot of the research has shown that that's actually really unhelpful and can
Mhm.
actually make things worse for that individual because it
Mhm.
pathologizes these experiences that they're having instead of getting them the help that they actually need.
Mhm.
And so sometimes even kind of those like hearing it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an immediate emergency that we need to do something about and get emergency services involved. Sometimes just listening and talking about it can actually help decrease those thoughts without having to go that far.
Yeah, I heard, I hate to steal his metaphor. I talked to Craig Bryan the other day, who's
Mhm.
amazing. And I'll let him come on the podcast and talk about his metaphor more. But he was talking about how just because you have a thought of suicide does not mean the house is on fire. It's like a smoke detector. It might be a beep. There's a beep going on, so let's check out what's going on. Why is it beeping? It does not mean the house is on fire. Unfortunately, very rarely it might, but if the house is on fire, there are things you can do. If it's not on fire, address whatever is going on, right?
For sure, yeah.
Um, The fourth question I asked was, how do we stop somebody from thinking about it or acting about it? And before we get to that question, I would really like to dig more into your current work that you're doing. It's called gaming theory, but it really does tease apart how somebody is thinking during a suicidal crisis. Would you share some of your work with us?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the biggest issues that, I talked about earlier is that not everybody who thinks about suicide ends up acting on those thoughts. And so we have to figure out who's going to act on those thoughts and why. And so I spent a lot of my early career looking at this idea of capability, which means does the person have the ability to act on those thoughts? And more recently, I've kind of gone to this point of like, well, people have this capability, but what makes them decide to use that capability to then act on those thoughts? And so I kind of dug into the decision literature around this and have found that we don't really know that much about decision making within the context of suicide crises. We look at it as like an impulse control decision making error, or these
Yeah,
folks are kind of impulsive, or they're making discounting errors.
yeah.
But we don't really look at the process of decision making itself. And so I dug into behavioral economics, and I have to thank my mom for this because she forced me to take a microeconomics class in my undergrad. She really wanted me to
Thanks,
be a business
Mom.
major. Thanks, Mom. Um, and so, I went back into some of that literature, and remembered my class, like the class I took on like game theory, essentially kind of looking at, how do we make decisions about what to do when we don't have perfect information about what the opponent is going to do. And so
Hmm.
I dug into the game theory literature because it's a really big part of decision theory in the behavioral economics world.
Hmm.
And there's this idea called games against nature, where you're kind of in this game that you're playing, you're going up against nature. So, for example, it's storming and raining in Seattle right now. But if I didn't had to make a guess last night about whether or not I should bring an umbrella, and I didn't know what nature was going to do, I'm going to have to make decisions under this uncertainty of what's going to happen in nature. And so that's this work that I'm doing right now is built on this idea of games against nature. A person doesn't know tomorrow, like what's going to happen in their life. Is it going to get better? Is it going to
Yeah,
get worse? But they
yeah.
have to make this decision to continue living, or if they're going to have to make this decision if they're going to die. And so in this framework, there's something we call utility, which is, a person's calculation of the payoffs of each of the choices they have in the moves that they can make. So for example, there's a payoff for living, right? There's a
Mhm.
payoff for dying. And so we have to uh, people calculate the payoffs in different ways for themselves. And so in this work that I'm doing, I'm looking at this payoff matrix in terms of thinking about what are people perceiving as the costs for living? What are they perceiving as the benefits for living? What are they perceiving as the cost of dying? And what are they perceiving as the benefits of dying? And using those to then create this utility of living and the utility of dying. And so a lot of folks say, well, then are you saying suicide's a rational decision? And I'm just going to go out and say that's not what I think. I think that oftentimes we have this idea of what folks call bounded rationality. So we are making what seems to be rational decisions to us bounded by our perception of what reality is in this moment. And so to
Hmm.
others, it may not seem like a rational decision, but to us in that moment, it might seem very rational. Um,
Hmm.
because that's the biggest kickback I always get on this idea of like, well, are you saying suicide's rational? And I think from where I'm seeing it from this framework, yes, there's a degree of perceived rationality to it as
Hmm.
people weigh what are the costs, what are the benefits of each living versus dying.
Yeah. Okay. So overall, if I can summarize that, in a suicidal crisis, people are making a decision
Hmm.
about what is going on in their context at that moment. So it has to do with what are the benefits of staying alive right now as I'm contemplating not staying alive, and what are the costs of staying alive right now. And
Hmm.
so balancing those out will help them make the decision in that moment. So many people who are not in a suicidal crisis, you're not really making a decision about whether or not to live or die because it's not even coming up as
Mhm.
something, a thought. Your lungs keep breathing, your heart keeps beating, and you're probably engaged in some sort of life. It might be a neutral point. You're not on a high or on a low, but you're pretty much just going through your life. But
Mhm.
during a suicidal crisis, if we want to understand how somebody might make a decision about how to proceed,
Mhm.
they are contemplating what's the cost of staying alive and
Mhm.
what's the cost of dying? What's the benefit of staying alive and what's the benefit of dying? Okay.
Yeah, so the goal is to really look at this as a valuation problem, right? So how are people weighting the value of life versus the value of death in that moment? And I
Yeah.
think what's unique about this is that oftentimes suicide is very complex for people, and decision making is very complex. We cannot truly capture all of the reasons why somebody might want to die by suicide or want to continue living in a survey, right? We
Hmm.
do a lot of surveys and psychological research, and I find that as I work with these surveys, I find that we're not truly capturing every possible permutation or combination of things that could drive a person from thinking about suicide into acting on those thoughts. And
Hmm.
so I kind of thought about this as a potential way of being able to capture the unique diversity of reasons why somebody might go from thinking about suicide into acting on those thoughts, while also providing a number that we could use to then model and formalize maybe like the ability to then predict whether or not somebody would be able to would go on to act on those thoughts versus not act on those thoughts. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of the I'm trying to bring in that more qualitative individual piece into a more formal model using this framework.
And the reason why this framework is important is because there might be somebody around, whether it's a provider, a family member, a friend, there might be somebody around during a suicidal crisis. So when that person is actually engaged in evaluating what they're
Mhm.
going to do next during a suicidal crisis, understanding how they might be making that decision can be helpful for the conversation to move forward or the impact. What happens next? What do we do next?
Yeah, so I think that the game theory stuff that I'm working on, I don't think it's very different from actually what we're already doing clinically. I think oftentimes we ask people, well, what are the reasons for living, right? What are the
Mhm,
reasons for dying? I think this breaks
mhm,
it up a little bit more into costs and benefits, because when I looked at the qualitative responses that people put in this study in these four quadrants, a lot of it are things like financially,
mhm,
this is a huge cost of living. I don't have the money to pay rent or buy food. Or I'm dragging my family down because I have all of my medical costs. I see a lot of very practical reasons or practical costs of living and practical benefits of dying for them.
mhm,
And
mhm,
it's really sad to see kind of all of these things that we could do a lot of problem solving
mhm,
around. It's kind of, if people had the money, right? Like maybe choosing to live is going to be a lot easier than when not having that money
mhm.
to continue living. And so I think it gives us a really interesting map or roadmap of what we need to do to help people feel like their lives are worth living.
Yeah. Do you mind taking us through some of the what you've heard, some of the benefits of living are and some of the costs of living? You said one was financial.
Yeah, so benefits of living was a lot of very relational things. So being able to be there for my kids, being able to be there for my family, taking care of my dogs and my cats, right? Those oftentimes come up in those reasons or benefits for living.
Hmm.
And then with the cost of living, financial is a huge one. Knowing when knowing they're able to can't afford to eat or pay rent or like they have all of these bills that are just kind of unsurmountable for them um,
Hmm.
are real come up quite frequently in those uh, cost of living column. And then there's the benefits of dying column, which we oftentimes see like things I won't have to deal with these really difficult emotions I'm going through, right? I won't have to deal with the chronic pain that I'm experiencing. And then when it comes down to cost of dying, a lot of it is just that, well, I won't be able to experience, like art, music, good food, spending time with my family. And so while the opposing quadrants, right, so benefits of living and costs of dying seem like they should be one-on-one, what
Hmm.
we realize is that they're actually not, and people weight things very differently in these columns, and different things come up And so they're not exactly a match. So not every benefit of living is a cost of dying. And so
Mhm.
that was really interesting to see when we looked at some of the qualitative responses to those questions.
And so therapeutically, you said we have interventions now that do address this, and we do.
Mhm.
Um, how might this research help them address it better, or help a family member? If you have a family member or a friend, what are some recommendations you can give to people listening who knows somebody who's suicidal, who wants to help them when they're in a crisis? What can you offer them?
Yeah, so I think that with I just want to caveat that this research right now is still very much in its infancy. We're just kind of starting to analyze the data. And so I want to kind of just throw that caveat out there. The cross-sectional findings were really interesting in that, this ratio, closing the gap between benefits of living and costs of living, right, and making living more attractive. Um, Moderates this relationship between, the ratio of cost of dying versus benefits of dying. And so having lots of, a higher value for life actually can really help buffer the effect, or not buffer the effect, but what we're seeing is that it does change the effect on the relationship between the utility of dying and actual having, desire for death and suicidal urges. And so longitudinally, though, the only effect we were able to see was that the cost of living was really the only effect that sustained itself after a week. And so it seems like that the biggest thing we could do is help people reduce the cost of living. Is there some ways that we can make choosing life a little bit easier for them by not just kind of, increasing the benefits of living, but actually reducing the current cost? So what's making living difficult for you right now? Is it pain reduction? Is it finances? Is it, help finding a job or feeling connected to other folks? Will kind of help reduce the cost of living for them. Oh, Tracy, you're muted.
Sorry. So not just my dog was barking in the background. I had to mute. Not just making sure to have a conversation about the reasons for living, the benefits of living, but having a conversation and strategies to reduce those costs for living.
Mhm.
So if somebody's having pain, um, making sure that all avenues for pain relief are available. If somebody's having financial stress or is unemployed, all avenues are really being explored with them,
Yeah.
which can be a stressful conversation
Oh, yeah.
um, during the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and then, sometimes, there are psychiatric reasons, right, why living is difficult, right? Living with a lot of trauma, living with, a lot of psychiatric disorders could be one of those costs of living. But I think a lot of times what I'm seeing in the data that we have is that those psychiatric reasons aren't as up in the forefront as some of those more functional reasons like finances, like pain that really get in the way of just living day-to-day life.
Any hope for people? This is kind of a hard question, but
Mhm.
I know people listening might think, well, how can we help them financially? How can we help them with pain? Do you have any
Mhm.
advice on that?
Um, I think it comes back to your book, Tracy, like help seeking, right? Like finding help for pain management. There's a lot of, behavioral medicine approaches to dealing with pain or chronic pain, right? We have, acceptance and commitment therapy, which could be really helpful for managing chronic pain, or not managing pain as in decreasing the pain, but at least lessening its impact on
Yeah,
someone's life.
yeah.
That can be really helpful. Financially, that's a really tough one. To me, that's a very big political issue that we as a society should be thinking about, right? How do we reduce the burden of living on folks who don't have the finances?
Hmm.
Is it kind of making sure that we have employment support? Um, is there something we need to be changing about our welfare system? And
Hmm.
I'm sure folks have different ideas on what that looks like. And I know there's also charities, churches, communities that also help with a lot of these functional, um, functional things. But I think, that's something that we have to be thinking about from a more societal level, as well as kind of on the individual level of what we individually can do for them.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for the nod to my book, which is sitting right here. Um, I think you're right in terms of if you're having a conversation with somebody who's in a suicidal crisis who is saying, I'm having financial stress or I'm in too much pain, and they also are not open to exploring various options to manage their financial situation or to manage their physical situation. We do have ways of having those conversations in order to help them truly explore the options. Many people will say, well, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work. Or there's stigma. I'm too ashamed to tell people. We do have ways that we can have those kind of conversations with people in a very non-judgmental, very genuine way to help them truly explore the options. It's probably not true that there are no options. There are various options, and some of them might not be the right options for that individual. That is okay. They don't have to choose an option that's not right for them, but at least open up to other various options that could be helpful to them. Have that conversation, see if they're willing to try some of those other strategies.
And one of the things that have really stuck with me over the years is actually some of the work that I did with you, Tracy, where we were looking at, how do we challenge people's beliefs about therapy or even getting help, right? Like a lot of times people have, an image of what therapy looks like, someone laying on a couch, right? The very Freudian approach to therapy, or, they have maybe had a bad experience with therapy before that wasn't
Mhm.
very helpful. And there's this belief that, no, this isn't going to be helpful for me, or that the doctors aren't going to listen to me. There's these beliefs that they've accumulated. And I just remember kind of we were in working on your study, right? Trying to think about, okay, how do we challenge these beliefs? How do we kind of help loosen up the grip that some of these beliefs have on their willingness to go and seek help? Um,
Mhm.
and so, even having conversations about like, what makes you hesitate about
Mhm.
going to find help? What makes you hesitate about visiting a doctor and maybe even being a support person?
Mhm.
And that can be really helpful. So for someone who struggles to you know, uh, who feel like the doctor's not going to listen to them, yeah,
Yeah.
going with them to the doctor's appointment can be really helpful. And just,
Yeah.
either, saying, well, yeah, you're right, your doctor kind of sucks, right? Or like, or, being like, well, yeah, like here's like help, here's kind of maybe where you can advocate for yourself a little bit more in
Right.
this appointment. So, yeah.
Yeah, for suicidal individuals, it's true. The number one belief that people have about treatment that keeps them out of treatment is that they think if they go to treatment, they will get this one particular treatment that they don't want. So for somebody who's suicidal, they aren't going to treatment because the second they admit to a provider that they're suicidal, they believe they'll be thrown in the hospital. So they're not going, they're not talking about it. That is not necessarily true. So while it is true, if you indicate that you are at imminent risk, you are going to die that day by suicide, you are likely to be seen by a provider and get maybe get at least an overnight stay at a hospital. It is not true that if you indicate that you're having thoughts of suicide, that you'll be thrown in the hospital. And so even the way to state that to a provider can be different. You can say, I'm really struggling right now. I feel like I need to talk about what's going on for me. I don't want to have an inpatient stay, but I do want to talk with somebody. You can choose what type of treatment you want. Many people with substance use disorders, and that might be in play here, um, they will say, I'll go and talk to somebody, or I might even want some sort of medication to help me with my reducing my substance use. But I don't want to go to AA. Many of them will say that. You don't have to go to AA just because you have a substance use disorder. And so knowing what you don't want is an important part of the conversation. You don't have to get what you don't want. You can open the door to something else. And sometimes you don't know about all the options. We actually have various options for most of the mental health and substance use treatment conditions, and you can choose the one that you prefer. For somebody in a suicidal crisis, probably the emphasis is going to be on keeping you safe. For
Mm.
somebody who's having just thoughts of suicide, the emphasis is going to be on let's talk that out. Let's figure out what's going on for you and get you to the right treatment or get you through this thought, what's just to identify what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Okay,
it's just
so
getting some sleep, right? I remember so many of
yeah,
the folks from those studies were like, we were like,
I
well,
just
what
want
about
sleep.
treating sleep? And they're like, oh man, yeah, if I can get a good night's sleep,
Hmm.
that would really help.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are sleep treatments. So if that is the issue that you're just really feeling off your game, um, um, and you have massive sleep disturbance, there are treatments for sleep. So, by the way, our website, www.choosinghelp.com, has a lot of the information about various resources. So, if you're somebody listening and want to know more about various types of treatment, you can look at our website and find out where to go for treatments. Um, what before I let you go,
Hmm.
is there any last notes you want to offer to the audience or anybody who's more interested in your work?
Yeah, so I think, I'm still, again, working on a lot of this game theory stuff. We're still trying to figure out the math and feeling very confident about like the idea behind it and this val idea of valuation. We're just trying to figure out the right combinations of math to really formalize the numbers part of it. But the qualitative parts of it, I think, folks are seeking treatment and they even just kind of write out a little quadrant for themselves, like a pros and cons list, right? Of what are the pros and cons of dying right now? What are the pros and cons of living right now? And bring that to a provider to just show them like, hey, this is what's making me having a really hard time choosing life right now. Help me here, right? That could be a really easy way to kind of make sure that your needs are being met. Because I think oftentimes when you go into treatment, clinicians might, they have their standard questions that they need to ask you. They might not necessarily tap into what's making
Yeah.
life difficult to live right now. And so I think that's one way that folks can really advocate them for themselves um, in seeking treatment. And if the paper is not published yet, I'm hoping it'll get published soon. I'm trying to put the paper back in after a minor revision today. And so hopefully it'll be published within the next few months. But we're still kind of working on it. A lot of my grad students are trying to tease apart the qualitative data right now and looking at the different types of costs and benefits people put down. And so, yeah, lots more to come on this front.
I think this is wonderful work. And I can't tell you how many individuals I've worked with over the years who had difficulty identifying reasons for living or benefits for living. Um, the truth is we tend to think the bad things in our life, the negative things in our life can get very loud and it can be difficult to really understand all of those benefits that are very much true for an individual. I haven't worked with anybody yet who I've said, "Hey, let's talk those out." Who said, "Oh, I have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven." They tend to go, "It's hard to think of one."
Hmm.
But it doesn't take long, maybe even 10 minutes before they have an enormous list. Sometimes you do need a little help generating that list. So even going to a provider or a friend and um, trying to do that list for yourself, ask for a little help. I seem to be more focused on this side versus this side. I think I need a little bit of help because it truly can be difficult to identify those reasons for living. They're there. There's often a large list, but sometimes you just need help figuring out what those are.
Yeah, and for folks who might be interested in any future studies on this and want to participate, my lab website is we can post that somewhere. I think it's www.crisislab-seattle.com. And all of our latest findings and studies are all posted there. And the ways to contact me are also posted on our website. And so I'm always interested in hearing, from the community what will make this maybe like what's relevant for them and ideas that they have. In fact, we've been trying to show up to all of the out of the darkness walks in Seattle and this general area. So then that way we can hear from the community, hey, like what is it that you want us to study next? Or what do you think about this current way we're thinking about things? Um, what are some questions you might have about how we're weighting these decisions and everything like that. So we would love to hear from the community as well.
Absolutely. I think that's great. So Dr. Law, Keyne Law at Seattle Pacific University. The website is
Seattle.com.
www.crisislab-seattle.com.
I
And
can
our
post in
website
that.
for resources is www.choosinghelp.com. And thank you for being here. Thank you so much for your insight on this very important issue.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tracy.